Imagine this, you hold 28 records for your conference, you've combined for over 15,000 yards in your career, and you had over 4 years of starting experience against some of the best defenses in all of college football. But the NFL still doesn't want you. You were also being mentored by NFL quarterback Gardner Minshew, who went to the same high school as you, and despite all of this, you not only go undrafted in the 2025 NFL Draft, but you struggle to even land an undrafted free agent deal. You've already worked out with 2 teams, and based on the research I've done so far, it doesn't look like you'll be signing anywhere this fall. This is the unique and crazy situation that is currently happening to Will Rogers. I don't know if you guys remember him, but he was one of the best quarterbacks in the early 2020s while he was at Mississippi State, and recently just spent a year at Washington. The guy was at one point supposed to be a first-round pick and put up crazy numbers. In today's video though, we're going to talk about how Will Rogers got to this point, go through his rise, his fall, and I'm going to try to explain why the NFL doesn't want him. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about what happened to Will Rogers. So in order to understand how Will Rogers got to this point, we first need to go back in time. Rogers had always grown up on the football field and in the coach's booth, thanks to his father. His dad was Brandon High School's offensive coordinator, and his dad's name was Wyatt Rogers. Will had been immersed in the game since he was a baby, and he had been asking about plays and routes since he was old enough to talk. The first time he remembers being on the football field with his dad was when he was coaching at Winston Academy. Will was just 6 years old, and he said that's when his expectation of winning was born. His dad said, quote, "Obviously when he was a baby, he'd sit in my lap and we'd watch football. I could tell he was really dialed at the age of 5 when he'd start asking questions about this or that route. He's a stereotypical coach's son." One story in particular, Will remembers getting in the vehicle with his dad at 4 or 5 a.m. He would go to practice with him in the mornings, and this was also his introduction to film study, something that became very important in his life. By the time Will was 8 years old, Rogers was telling his dad which routes were being run during college games, and Rogers also moved to Brandon High School as a 7th grader and immediately became a big part of their middle school football team. What's interesting is he joined a player on the roster by the name of Gardner Minshew. He would spend time with his dad and Gardner while they were in the film room, and he'd carefully listen and take in every piece of information possible on how to become a leader and manage the expectations of the quarterback spot. Minshew was the player that Rogers learned from as a young kid, and he went on to become a college football superstar at Washington State, and then eventually in the NFL. Will said, quote, "Gardner told me when I was in 7th grade that my time was going to come. He said just be patient and let it come to you." Eventually, flash forward a couple years to his sophomore season, Will Rogers became Brandon High School's starting quarterback, and through just a couple of games, he was already one of the top quarterbacks in the state, and his ceiling was ridiculously high. An opposing coach said, quote, "He's not your typical sophomore. He's been in the box with his dad for the last few years during some games, and he's mature beyond his years." What's interesting is Gardner Minshew ended up being a superstar while he was at Brandon High School, but nobody really expected this from Rogers. As I said, during his sophomore year he took over, and he threw for 2,476 yards with 18 touchdowns, and then as a junior, he went over the 3,000 yard mark. In terms of his recruitment, it kind of started out with a bang, as Washington State was the first team to reach out, offering him a scholarship in early December. When Gardner Minshew realized that his coaching staff and Will Rogers had connected, he said, quote, "I just started blowing Will up and telling him what kind of kid he was and how good I thought he could be." But there was another school that had his loyalty. Even before Will could pick up a football, he was born an Ole Miss Rebel. Every season when the Egg Bowl would happen, Will was wearing red and blue and yelling "Hotty Toddy." That was until he met Joe Moorhead. His dad said there was something different about Joe, and he told Will that if he committed to him, he wouldn't bring another 2020 quarterback recruit on campus, and he wanted it both ways. One extremely important visit would happen back in 2019, as both him and his high school teammate, Jonathan Mingo, an NFL draft pick, and Rogers' family went along with him. That weekend is when Will got his official offer, and he could not turn it down. While Ole Miss had been in his heart for years, Will had grown to love Mississippi State and the fact they made him a priority. Washington State was the primary competition, but the Rebels also told Will that an offer was likely if he made a trip to Oxford. He ended up picking Mississippi State, as he said, quote, "I loved Ole Miss, but once recruiting got going, I opened my mind a little bit more, and I left my junior day my 10th grade year with a feeling. I thought this was the place, and I liked Coach Moorhead. and Ole Miss never wanted me enough to offer me, but Mississippi State did. I'm pretty happy with where I ended up. At 6'3", he didn't have a recruiting ranking at the time of his commitment, but he chose Mississippi State over Washington State. He ended up finishing his senior year with 3,608 yards, 38 touchdowns, and only 3 picks. His team did come up short on the season, but he had proven everything he needed to be a starting quarterback heading off to the SEC. Joe Moorhead thought Rodgers would be a perfect fit for their offensive system, and that he was a very mature player in person, and he ended up being the only quarterback in the class, just like Joe promised. His dad actually stayed out of his son's decision-making process and wanted him to make it organically. Ultimately, he believed his son made the right decision, and hopefully he'd become a future Bulldogs quarterback. According to 24/7 Sports, he was a 3-star recruit, the number 24 pro-style quarterback, and the 636th best player in the class of 2020. So how would Will end up doing in Starkville? 2020 was an interesting time for Will Rodgers in Mississippi State, as he was going to be the backup to KJ Costello, who they brought in from Stanford, and KJ was a Week 1 Heisman against LSU, but by the end of the year, he ended up getting an opportunity to play. Will became the first freshman to ever start for Mike Leach, the 7th freshman to start in Mississippi State history, and in 9 games, he ended up having about 2,000 yards. On top of that, he had 11 touchdowns, and Will was starting to show he had a bright future in the SEC. His sophomore season would be even better, as Mississippi State got off to a hot start, and he ended up throwing for 4,739 yards with 36 touchdowns. Will became one of the best quarterbacks in college football his second year in Starkville, but nobody was really talking about him, except draft pundits were. Going into the 2022 season, many believed that Will Rodgers could be a first-round pick with some refinement. Some were worried about him playing in Mike Leach's air raid system, but a couple of mock drafts had this guy going really high. One mock draft had him going to the Carolina Panthers with the number 8 overall pick, and honestly, Will lived up to the hype. In 2022, he ended up having 3,974 yards with 35 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. Will Rodgers had built upon his successful sophomore campaign, but would decide to come back for the 2023 season. Going into 2023, things were an absolute disaster, and he got screwed behind the scenes. Numbers dropped in pretty much every way, as he only completed 59% of his passes, only had 1,600 passing yards, and 12 touchdowns. Mississippi State was now in their first year under new head coach Zach Arnett, after tragically Mike Leach had passed away. But there was even more tragedy to this story, as he ended up getting hurt at the end of the 2023 season, and also got played. On December 12th of 2022, Will and his dad sat down with Zach Arnett, the coach. He promised him that he would keep Mike Leach's air raid offense, but that didn't happen. Will's dad said, quote, "Arnett flat out lied to us sitting in our den. He said they'd be crazy to change the offenses after all the success we had had. But he did change that offense. He scrapped the air raid for a pro style of offense, and it just didn't click. To make matters worse, Will got hurt in the middle of the season with a shoulder injury, and this was an absolute disaster." Arnett obviously didn't last, and they decided to bring in a new head coach in Jeff Lebby, but Will was not going to be sticking around. After being courted by several schools, Will would settle on the Washington Huskies, where they had head coach Kalen DeBoer. He told Will he could be the successor to Michael Penix Jr., as he had just led the Huskies to a national championship game appearance. Rodgers really liked DeBoer and enjoyed his visit to Seattle and looked forward to being the Huskies quarterback. Rodgers said, quote, "They throw the ball around a lot like we did my first 3 years at Mississippi State." But then things would change as Kalen DeBoer would take the Alabama job and Rodgers was back to square one. Some thought that he would transfer to Alabama, but that would not end up happening, and not knowing who would take Kalen DeBoer's place and whether the new coach would bring in a new quarterback, Rodgers would enter the portal again on January 12th. Alabama, Miami, South Carolina, WKU, and Michigan all became possibilities, but they decided to meet with Washington's new head coach Jedd Fisch and Brennan Carroll, Pete Carroll's son, as he was the new offensive coordinator for them. The Rodgers family liked what they had heard, and Jedd Fisch very much wanted Will to remain at Washington. Fisch's offense wasn't exactly like the air raid, but it had many of the same concepts. At Arizona, his teams threw the ball on nearly 3/4 of their plays and had more than 300 passing yards per game. Fisch also had 13 years of NFL coaching experience, and this was something that factored heavily into Will Rodgers' decision, as ultimately he wanted to play on Sundays. So yeah, he decided to stick with Washington, but what's interesting is he was somewhat forgotten or ignored at this point. That was very odd, as he had over 40 starts, over 12,000 yards, and nearly 100 touchdowns by that time. But because of that one bad year, he kind of faded into irrelevancy, and now he'd have to pick up the pieces and save his career at Washington. He ended up starting all but 2 games for the Huskies in 2024, and he ended up throwing for 2,458 yards and 14 touchdowns in 11 games. After not throwing an interception throughout his first 5 games of the year, he threw 7 picks in his next 6 games, and he was benched in favor of DeMond Williams midway through their matchup against UCLA. Will Rogers ended up having an okay season. As I said, he threw for 2,500 yards and 14 touchdowns, but that just wasn't going to cut it. He didn't really fix his reputation, and Washington wasn't bad, but they weren't really good either. In total, the guy had about 15,000 yards to his name, over 100 touchdowns, and nearly 30 school records, but I guess NFL teams just straight up did not care. He had had back-to-back bad seasons, was coming off of an injury in 2023, and I think most importantly, didn't really prove he could play in a pro style of offense. Sure, he put up ridiculous numbers while he was at Mississippi State, but that system is meant for him to do that. I'm not going to say pretty much anybody can do that, because obviously it's extremely difficult, but I guess a lot of the things that NFL scouts are looking for aren't really present in that modern air raid style of offense that Mike Leach had. This combined with 2 down years led him to going undrafted, but what happened next has sort of been shocking to me. After originally getting an undrafted free agent deal with the Seattle Seahawks, things would not work out there, and he tried out for the Packers. Currently, the Packers already have 5 quarterbacks on the roster, as they have Taylor Ogersma, the guy from Canada, Malik Willis, Sean Clifford, and then of course Jordan Love. The Packers are not in a dire situation to get a quarterback. I'm not quite sure he even makes the practice squad. This is all really fascinating to me though, as it seems the NFL just doesn't want Will Rogers. Whether that's because of the system he played in, whether it's because he's somewhat washed up, or maybe there's something else going on. That's not something I can really answer, but for a guy who had over 100 touchdowns, 15,000 yards, and 4 years of starting experience against SEC or Big Ten defenses, it's pretty shocking to me. There are a lot of other quarterbacks in this year's draft class, or guys that went undrafted, that I don't really think were all that good, but they're getting plenty of opportunities here. If you would have told me that Tyler Shuck was going to be a second-round pick to the Saints, but Will Rogers couldn't even sign with a team, I would have called you crazy, especially a few years ago. I think scouts would have as well, as remember going back in time, he was supposed to be the number 8 overall pick to the Panthers in some mock drafts, so it's been quite the fall off for Will, but I hope he scrapes and claws his way onto an NFL roster, and maybe Gardner Minshew will help him get on a team. Who knows, but at this point, to me, it's shocking that the NFL doesn't want Will Rogers, but at the same time, I guess it makes sense. But what do you guys think? If you're an NFL fan or a Mississippi State or Washington fan, what happened to Will Rogers, and why do you think the NFL doesn't want him? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon. Until next time, peace.